And I'll start with, I talked a little bit about the antecedents directors, early independent film directors like Gus Van Sant and Jim Jarmusch, who showed a different kind of, popularized or helped popularize independent filmmaking and showed a different way of making movies, and this had a big effect on early filmmakers of the 90s. And I think where you can really trace back this slacker generation stuff is in the film, better aptly titled, Slacker by Richard Linklater, who would later go on to do other films like Before Sunrise and Bad News Bears and a few other slacker movies before he got to that, and Dazed and Confused and Suburbia. And I'll talk about those movies a little bit later. But Slacker is a very interesting movie. If you've ever seen it, it's kind of boring, actually, to be honest. It doesn't completely work, and it's very dated. But it was totally based on this complete idea of let's just show people their natural environments talking about whatever. Not talking about anything that's going to advance a plot. There really is no plot. The movie moves from one character to another really fast. There's no set main characters, which in that sense is a little different from the other movies I'll be talking about. But it's all about this 90s Generation X culture. What do they like to talk about? What are they interested in? What kind of money are they making or not making? And what do they do with their time? Where do they go? The movie starts with a guy who's getting a ride, played by Linklater himself. And it starts in the morning, early morning, goes through the entire course of a day through the movie, and at the end ends with a bunch of people at a concert. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about the slacker era generation of movies. This passage of time, these environments, how do they affect the characters? How do they inform the characters? And purely dialogue based, not exactly a comedy, but not exactly a drama. It has everything. The only thing that really separates it from where these sorts of films would go later is the fact that there's no set ensemble, there's no set main characters. It changes characters every, 5 to 10 minutes. So that, I think, is the first true slacker movie. Now on the flip side, I don't have the DVD with me, which is weird because I do own it. But on the flip side, on a very, very popular note, now Slacker was made for like 12 cents in Austin with all of Linklater's friends, and it's super low budget kind of movie. But on the opposite side, and this kind of talking about how I think stand-up comedy sort of played a big effect on these types of movies. Around the same time, a little bit later, we had Wayne's World. Now, Wayne's World is a very popular comedy, obviously. Everyone has seen Wayne's World. And if you remember, the Wayne's World came from a SNL skit. That was, a 5-minute skit about a bunch of kids hanging out in their basement. There's that environmental character again. And the Penelope Spears, who directed the movie for Wayne's World, she had this very interesting vision for where that sketch would go, and it was all about what do these kids do when they're not recording a public access show. Well, they're hanging out outdoors, they're going to concerts, they're playing hockey in the street. They don't have money. Or they still live with their parents, making minimum wage or less. or nothing at all. Now, there are things about Wayne's World that obviously don't completely click with what I'm talking about, because there is very contrived plot. The whole idea of Noah's Arcade and all that stuff. They're trying to buy the show, and I think it's very, very over the top because it's an SNL movie and it's a high budget movie. So they have the means to get as ridiculous as they want to. This is very more obviously a comedy. There's not a lot of dramatic moments in Wayne's World, but it definitely does depict that slacker generation very well. A lot of pop culture references, which is really where the pop culture reference thing kind of started, was in these sort of slacker films, and in a sense really been way overused. The Gilmore Girls crap, but before that, it kind of started here. It was about, what are these people interested in talking about? Well, they're talking about what they watch on TV. They talk about the movies they've seen, and a lot of movie references and things like that. And the whole passage of time, night and day, while it's not... Wayne's World does not take place within a 24-hour period. There's a lot of what is their nightlife? What do they like to go out and do? They hang out, they cruise on the Strip, and they sing to Bohemian Rhapsody and bang their head at the guitar solo. That's like kind of a classic 90s slacker generation scene. If I was making a real documentary, I would splice that scene right about here. So, those are, I think, the first two movies that kind of said, this is the 90s, this is not the 80s, this is a new generation that we're marketing to. On one side you have Slacker by Richard Linklater, which was made for 12 cents and nobody really saw until 5 or 6 years later. And then on the other side you have Wayne's World, which is this huge high-budget, Lorne Michaels produced thing based on an SNL skit. But those, I think, would be the two roots to the tree that would later grow. Okay, now we'll move to what I think is the ultimate slacker film. This has everything that I'm talking about, and if you haven't guessed it by now, it's pretty obvious. But it's Clerks by Kevin Smith. Oh, this movie just is exactly what I'm talking about. It is all about alienation, all about the lower middle class, all about the younger youth generation. What do they do with their time, and boredom and dissatisfaction and environmental character, because they're in a convenience store the whole time. The convenience store is a character of the movie. Outside the convenience store, there's a couple of bum drug dealers that all they do is they hang out, they talk to people. There's people walking in and out of the store all day. And that's all it is. It's a big talking heads movie where it's a bunch of people hanging out in a convenience store. And there's little character arcs that go on through it, specifically with the Dante character, who has kind of a love triangle going on. But, I mean, that's pretty much it. It's very loose plot, very fluid kind of plot. It could, from the first 20 minutes, the movie could really go anywhere. And even by the last 20 minutes, the movie could go a lot of places. Of course, some people know that the original ending was changed because it was too dramatic, which also, again, lends itself to that slacker sort of thing where, is this a comedy, is it a drama? We don't really know, we don't really care, we just want it to be what it is. If it's funny, great. If it's not, then that's the type of film we wanted to make in the first place. And it's shot, again, very, very low budget, but then this grew probably largely because of this alternative generation, this Generation X kind of thing. Really, it found its audience really, really fast. It became a cult classic instantly, almost. And later, Smith would go on to make Mallrats, which is a much less successful film. But Mallrats had a lot of those same tropes, too. It just placed in a different setting. It's kind of more decidedly a comedy than Clerks was. But it has all that same, 24-hour period, boredom, alienation, blah, 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 slackers hanging out in a mall. It's kind of a character in the film. and then even later with Chasing Amy, I think he's still speaking to that generation. He's just telling more of a specific story. It's a sort of a better written movie, to be honest, than Clerks. But he's letting that generation kind of grow up a little bit, because by that time, 1997, that generation was growing up. So it's sort of a transitory movie, I suppose, but I think it still really fits in well with the slacker generation films. Now, by 1994 and 1995, I'm starting to talk about the decline of these sort of movies. Now, they went on pretty strong all the way up through the 90s, but Hollywood kind of caught on, I guess, you know. I mean, obviously Wayne's World was a big Hollywood thing, but it was sort of accidentally a slacker movie. But Hollywood kind of caught on to this whole Kevin Smithy, Richard Linklater-y. Linklater had a lot of success with his follow-up to Slacker, which was Dazed and Confused. And Dazed and Confused deals with a lot of those same issues too. The only thing that really sets it apart is that it takes place in the 70s, so it has sort of a nostalgia sort of factor that doesn't really fit in with the Slacker generation. But other than that, it's definitely a Slacker film. But by 1995 especially, we started to see sort of Hollywood's version of the slacker film. And some of these movies were just as good, and some of them weren't quite as good, and some of them were pretty contrived and kind of tailored for MTV. But I think sort of the hallmark, if you will, of sort of the Hollywood version of a Linklater movie or a Hollywood Smith movie is Empire Records. Now, Empire Records kind of went on to become somewhat of a cult movie. So by this point, it was kind of obvious what the tropes and the themes were, and they wanted to just jam as much of them in there as possible. It's kind of a funny, kitschy little movie, and I enjoy it enough to own it, obviously. But it's definitely, obviously, it was. I call this movie. This movie was a soundtrack first and a movie second. They wanted to make a lot of pop culture references, and they wanted to have a cool alternative rock soundtrack, and they wanted to definitely market to that MTV generation, that Generation X, whatever they thought it was at the time. And they made this movie tailored to the slacker generation. So it has all those themes I've already discussed 1,000 times. Boredom, alienation, blah, 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 lower middle class, environmental character, passage of night and day. All of that stuff is completely encapsulated in this movie in a very sort of contrived, plastic way, along with Empire Records being sort of a plastic Hollywood version of the slacker film. But a lot of people kind of consider it a hallmark, is Reality Bites. I mean, that's the title, Reality Bites. Just think about that. That is the title of the movie. Nothing is more 90s and slacker than that. Nobody even says bites anymore. But it deals with all of those things, and there's sort of a love triangle story in there that's sort of central to the whole thing. And it has Janeane Garofalo, and it's directed by Ben Stiller, and he stars in it, and Ethan Hawke, and all these people that are sort of slacker generation actors. Generation X actors, whatever. And personally, I don't really like the movie because I feel like it has a very, I don't know what's a word I'm trying to really look for, a very naive view on love and relationships and things like that. It's like sort of the antithesis of Chasing Amy, which I think is a very realistic view of love and relationships and breakups and things like that. And then Reality Bites is just so purple. It's so on the other side of it. It's just... I dare say, not to sound anti-feminist, but I dare say just kind of a girly movie. It has like kind of like a Twilight sort of sense of love and relationships. But that's just my criticism. But as far as being a slacker generation movie, it has all those tropes that I'm talking about and all of those themes. And it definitely represents the 90s very well. So... sort of the middle era, I guess, if you will, is that 95, 96, 97.